Help us to hear your voice, feel your presence, and learn your love. Amen. How many people here have ever tried to get a kindergartner out the door for school? Yeah. Throughout all of our foster kids, we've had the pleasure of having 2 kindergartners live with us for a while. And both of them were actually pretty much the same when it came to this. They weren't the same in a lot of things, but they were pretty much the same when it came to this. Our morning would be the constant reminding of the next thing they need to do so that we can get out the door on time. That's all it was. You need to brush your teeth. You need to eat your breakfast. You need to make sure your work is in your bag. You need to put on your shoes. You need to remember how to tie your shoes. Right? Remember these mornings? Don't say that. It's just this constant reminding, because their ability to be committed to more than one task at a time is lacking, especially in the morning. Really, their ability to be committed to anything seems to be lacking. It also seems like they can't hear or listen to anything or anyone. Does that sound familiar? Here's the thing about this. The more I reflect on these mornings with kindergartners, the more I fully believe and realize that the church often functions just like these kindergartners. That means us. We are often unable to focus enough to be committed to pretty much anything. It's because I think we're often just too busy listening to all of the distractions. Right? And when we think about those kids in the morning, there's too many fun things that they want to do. They're distracted. I think that happens to us a lot. Max Lucado writes in his book, Gentle Thunder, "Once there was a man who dared God to speak. 'Burn like the bush you did for Moses, God, and I will follow. Collapse the walls like you did for Joshua, God, and I will fight. Still the waves like you did on Galilee, God, and I will listen.'" I mean, how often in our lives do we want God to show up in those kinds of ways, right? When we say, "God, just make your presence known," and we ask for these massive demonstrations. And so after the man said all this, he sat by a bush near a wall, close to the sea, and waited for God to speak. And God heard the man. So God answered. He sent fire, but not for a bush, but for a church. He brought down a wall, not of brick, but of sin. He stilled the storm, not of the sea, but of a soul. And God waited for the man to respond. And God waited and waited and waited. But because the man was looking at bushes and not hearts, bricks and not lives, seas and not souls, he decided that God had done nothing. And finally he looked to God and asked, "Have you lost your power?" And God looked at him and said, "Have you lost your hearing?" In other words, in getting children ready for school in the morning, I found myself repeating this phrase: "How many times do I have to tell you?" Have we lost our hearing? Have we lost our guide? I want us to listen to these words of Jesus. These are words meant to draw us in, meant for us to hear and listen, meant to move us, meant to bring us hope, meant to stir us to service. These aren't just plain words. These words have meaning. So hear these words of Jesus. In the Gospel of John, he says, and we'll read it again up here, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay my life down for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. Do we hear those words? Do we listen to these words of Christ? And when we do, I think we have to ask the question of where are we in this story? At some points in our life, we are the sheep, right? And we need people to guide us and to take care of us, to bring us into the fold. And at other points in our lives, we act like the shepherd, where we love for and care for one another. But at many points in our life, when things get difficult, we are as committed as the hired hands, or we would rather run away. Pastor Jimmy Hale shares this story. It's called "Who Saved Me?" He writes, during a terrible storm at sea that threatened every moment to carry the ship to the bottom, one of the ship's crew was doing something on the deck when a great sea struck the ship and he went over the deck, striking this man with great force, disabling him and carrying him into the mad waters. Although he was a good swimmer, he was so disabled that he could not keep above water. They saw him lifting up his imploring hands through the white foam, signifying his desire for help. But the captain said, "Don't lower a boat. For no small boat can live in this sea, in this terrific storm. We cannot save the man. The most we can do is save the ship." The vessel was bearing farther and farther from the helpless man, and once more they saw his imploring hands come up among the white caps further off, which moved all the hearts that witnessed it. And still the captain said a small boat must not be lowered, as it could not live a moment among these wild billows. But one man, who was an expert swimmer, was so moved by the imploring signals of the drowning man that he threw off his loose garments, saying, "I will save the man, or I will die with him." And so, plunging and surging into the deep, he struggled so bravely with the mad waters that he reached the poor man just as his strength had gone. He had given up and was filling with water and sinking down unconscious. He grasped him, and strange to tell, he brought him so near the ship that a small boat was lowered, and both men were taken up and laid down upon the deck. The one that had been swept overboard, entirely unconscious, and his deliverer nearly so. Appliances were used, and both were brought to consciousness. As soon as the rescued man opened his eyes and found he was not in the ocean, his first words were, "Who saved me?" And he was pointed to his deliverer still lying on the deck in his wet clothes. He crept to his deliverer and, putting his arms around his feet, and in the most tender and heart-moving tone of voice cried out, "I'm your servant. I'm your servant." And he felt he could never do enough for him. So the question becomes, would you not also put your arms about the feet of the great deliverer and say from a full heart, "Jesus, I'm your servant. I'm your servant. Ask anything of me, Jesus, and I will do the best I can. I am committed to serve you." We've moved through Lent. We've journeyed through the cross. We've celebrated the empty grave. We've encountered the resurrected Christ on the road to Emmaus. And today we are presented with Jesus telling us that what we've just witnessed and witness again and again every week, every time we ask for forgiveness, that he is completely and totally committed to service to us. Are we committed back? I told you this was going to be interactive, and so you're going to have to answer some questions for me. We're going to talk about commitments. And the first question I have for you are, what are the commitments of the world around us? Work. Marriage. I find that interesting. Family. Okay, if we were to turn on the TV and just watch, I don't know, any random channel for 30 minutes, out of that 30 minutes, about 8 to 10 of it's going to be these things called commercials that are going to tell us what society is committed to, right? So what are the commitments of society? Pretty smart? Pretty smile, yeah. Pretty smile. Food. Money. Right? We're all supposed to be following that little green arrow. That's going to give us all the answers. I think society's got a pretty interesting set of commitments. I read just the other day in the Ohio Council of Churches, they published these legislative briefs, and their March 14th legislative brief says, it was about gun violence and gun control and gun violence specifically in schools. And they write, pretty far into this brief, they write, quote, an absolute unacceptable action was reported by the father of a 14-year-old girl who was one of those gunned down. They're talking about in Florida. Fred Guttenberg met with Senator Rubio to urge that he led the effort to ban AR-15 assault rifle in Congress. Over the next few days, and I think this shows commitments of society, over the next few days, he received telephone calls from gun advocates harassing him and his family, even to the point of death threats. This is a family that buried their daughter only a few days before. So what are the commitments of society? They're interesting, and I think we're going to see how they probably all, not all, but a lot of them might be a little antithetical to what Jesus is trying to get across to us and what our commitments should be. Because he gives us a really clear example. In Matthew 25, are we familiar with this passage? If I say Matthew 25, does anyone know where I'm going with this? In Matthew 25, Jesus tells us what our commitments should be. He says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. And then the king will say to those at his right hand, come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. I bet you everybody wishes they sat over here today, right? Every time I read this text, I always think people think, oh, I sat on the wrong side. But maybe Jesus is facing that way, and so you guys are okay over here today. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. When we listed the commitments of society, we didn't list any of those, did we? We say feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked. So then I want us to turn this a bit more inward. I want to ask you, what are the commitments of our church? Feeding the hungry, right? We just packed bags of about 2,000 meals for the middle school, right? With food for home. What other commitments do we have in our church? Visit the lonely. Visit the sick. Teach. Prayer. Worship. Haiti. Relationship with people in Lakai. So then the next question is, if these are the things that we're committed to, how do we show our commitment to these ministries? Volunteering. Donating. Praying. Serving. We do it by allocating our time and resources. We do it by giving out of the abundance that God has blessed us with, right? And we're pretty good. We are pretty good at sponsoring and funding all of these ministries. We give to the designated ministries, but we do have a bit of an issue of giving to our general fund. That stuff gets us excited, and nobody listed that up there either, right? Nobody was like, oh, one of our commitments is making sure the lights are on. But we do a great job of funding all of that stuff. But sometimes we fall short on the general fund, the money we use to pay the bills, the staff, to make sure there's a central place for ministry. But I don't think it has to be that way. I don't think it has to be an either or. Because if we are committed to God's service, then we will give to make sure that all of these commitments are made. We won't wait for other people to fill in the gaps. We will make sure that the gaps are filled. Jesus sacrificed everything to bring us into his family. That's exactly what this gospel text in John is saying. That he will sacrifice everything for us, and he does. So then the question becomes for us, what are we willing to sacrifice to join him in bringing others into the family so that we don't act like those hired hands? Which brings us to the last one. So we looked at society, we looked at the church, but this one's probably going to be the toughest of all. What are my commitments? Not mine, but mine, right? What are your commitments? What are the commitments of us individually? Oh, you're already answering it. I was going to give this to you as homework. But yeah, okay, we'll start putting some up here. Caring for ourselves. I think if we are honest with ourselves, we're going to see a lot of carryover from the commitments of society and maybe not so much from the commitments of the church or from the commitments that Jesus gives us in Matthew 25. And so for this next week, I want us to ask us this question in our daily lives: what are my commitments? What are the things that I've committed myself to, and why? Because next week we're going to talk about the fruits of those commitments, the fruits of the ministries, the fruits of the things that we devote our resources and our time to. So will you please pray with me as we think about these commitments? God, I ask that over this next week you might help us to look inward, to see where we are spending our time, our energy, our money, our efforts, and to see if that matches where you want us to be spending all of our time, our energy, our money, our efforts, if that's where you want us to be committed. Please guide us to follow Jesus Christ in everything that we do. Amen.